We will now begin the Q&A segment. We had a deluge of questions, so we chose a few for Professor Sachs to answer.
So first of all, a group of questions about Korea's own development experiences. Now this is a bit more a general question, but it's a question which is also very applicable to Korea itself. It is that not a single country has been able to achieve economic development without destroying the environment. What makes you so confident that sustainable development is possible, other than just noting that it's a necessity and not a choice? And another question, our growth models seem to have failed to encompass aspects of sustainability. And this, it is the interesting question. It is that how should this experience of ours be reflected in college economics education and curricula? And another question, right now South Korea is engaged in a fierce battle against the corruption. Now, what should we focus on? Promoting economic growth in the short term or fighting this corruption as a matter of priority? And Korea has been talking about our performance indicators, which are focused on material achievements, but this has not led to a higher sense of healthy and happy life. And Korea happens to be one of the countries with the highest suicide rate, the highest level of depression among the people, and so on. So what is truly sustainable? Is our economic so-called success, has this been something which has been sustainable? And
you're reaching my memory limit.
Okay, so I'll stop here and let you answer those questions. You don't try to answer all of them, but you can sort of group them into one big category of question and answer it.
Great. Thank you, everybody, and also for your patience, because I talk a long time. Let me try to be brief. Actually, there are many, many examples of getting richer and getting cleaner in the United States and in Japan, and I think in Korea also. The air was a lot dirtier in the past, and we were able to take steps to shift from the kind of air that Beijing still has to clean air and to see the blue skies again. And this transformation is basically technological. For example, smokestack scrubbers enabled a lot of the ash and the pollutants from burning even coal to be taken out of the gas exhausts and to allow for much cleaner air. Or automobiles becoming much cleaner and causing much less smog. So there's lots of history of using the wealth to solve these problems. But there are some areas where this is not done. And most importantly, those involve cases where the pollution doesn't directly affect the polluters, but affects the whole world. So it's where the externalities cross borders. And climate change is the key example of that. If, when you put up carbon dioxide, it just warmed your own city, we would have solved this problem a long time ago. Because each city, some cities would be boiling by now, and they would say we have to shift to renewable energy. But when you put up carbon dioxide, within 30 days, it is uniformly mixed in the atmosphere, so it's affecting everyone else's climate. It is a pure externality. And stopping that externality is what we call a pure global public good. And therefore, we need global cooperation. That's first where we tend to fail. Second, we tend to fail when the effects are gradual. When you put smoke up, you know it's dirty today. You clean up the air, it's clean. But when you put up carbon dioxide, it changes the climate 30 years from now. That's very hard for the politicians to handle. And so certain kinds of pollutants are more difficult. When you engage in trade and you buy a tropical product that is the result of deforesting someplace to make room for growing that product, say it's palm oil that's used, and you are deforesting the island of Borneo indirectly, or something in the Amazon with meat production, then you don't know. And so that's another kind of externality, is the global trade in goods that induce environmental damage halfway around the world. This is where the big problems lie. If it's a matter of our own cities, our own water supply, our own air, it's true, some places still suffer. But most places, when they reach a certain level of income, clean up. But when it's a global externality, we require a level of consciousness and cooperation that's much more difficult. And when it is a long-term cumulative effect, it's even harder. I regard the climate change challenge as the hardest public policy problem in peacetime that the world has ever faced. Everything's wrong about it. It's long-term, it's global, it's scientifically filled with uncertainties, it requires massive technological change, it goes to the heart of the world economy, our fossil fuel energy system. If I were a politician, I'd hate it too. It just happens to be crucial for our safety that we address it. It's not a likable problem, but it's one that we urgently must solve, and we have the means to do it. Don't call me an optimist, though. Everything I say is we can solve these problems. I'm not making a forecast. I'm saying we need to solve these problems. We can solve these problems. In fact, there's a certain absurdity and tragedy of not solving these problems because these don't break the bank even. Why should we ruin the world when we barely get anything for doing it? If this required us to live in poverty forever and ever, it would be complicated. This requires small changes, modest changes, not the end of our civilization. That's what's so absurd. As I said in my analogy, which is how I think about it, we're in that car on the mountain pass. When you're on a mountain pass, you better follow the road. Because if you go straight, even a small change, you go over the cliff. Bad news. So I just want us to turn the steering wheel, that's all, so that we continue to follow the road. We should be able to do that. Second, on education, we need to teach this, obviously, everywhere. And it's important that people understand it. And we need to teach people that the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal is good fiction, but not fact. It's propaganda. It should be studied for its modern propaganda character. And we have to say to the propagandists, stop it. You're immoral. You're threatening the world. And Rupert Murdoch is just about at the top of my list as one of the world's disasters. I don't care how much money he has, we have to tell him no. Stop the garbage coming out of your newspapers and your Fox News and your television shows. They're lies. And it's a disgrace and it's despicable for the damage that it's causing to society. On the question of corruption, let me advise us all, study the political systems of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. I don't quite know how they do it, but they basically got rid of corruption. Really, truly. They did. There's a wonderful television show called Borgen, which is about Danish politics. And we have a television series called House of Cards that some of you may have seen. Now, in the American version, the would-be president pushes girls onto railroad tracks to shut them up. In Danish politics, the worst that happens is that someone is sent to Brussels rather than to a ministry. It's so civilized, it's wonderful. And the way that that television show starts is that a prime minister of Denmark accidentally puts a purchase of his wife on his official credit card and forgets to reverse it quickly enough because the aide says we'll take care of it, but then the news leaks and he has to resign as prime minister. That's real for Scandinavian politics. Use the wrong credit card, you're gone. I don't know how they do it, but it shows it's within the compass of the human spirit to actually have honest politics. Watch the money. As you know, you're facing it, we face it. I told you we have really wrecked our system in the United States because we have a Supreme Court that's so confused about right and wrong that it keeps making disasters for us. And at one point a few years ago, it said that anonymous corporate contributions, quote unquote, to politicians is free speech. That's not free speech, that's the end of free speech. So they got it exactly backwards. And our system is polluted with money. Look at Mr. and Mrs. Clinton taking mega speaking fees when she's running for president. People shovel them money, millions of dollars, because they think they'll have some access. It's horrible. What kind of democracy is this? We need to get under control again. And so we need rules to separate the money from the politics, because the politics is supposed to be about the people. It's not supposed to be money votes, it's supposed to be people votes. And we all need to find our Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian friends to tell us how to do it, because it's possible. This, I think, is the key point. Then on happiness, very interesting. And I would like to suggest you look online at a report that my colleagues and I just released from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network 2 weeks ago, called the World Happiness Report. Actually, I guess about 4 weeks ago by now, because time flies. The World Happiness Report for 2015. It studies the question of the relationship of money and happiness. This field of happiness economics, as it's sometimes called, started with an observation by a professor, Richard Easterlin, at University of Pennsylvania in 1984, where he looked at survey data of the United States from the 1950s to the 1980s. And the survey question was, how do you rate your life on a scale from 0 to 4, basically, for the surveys that he looked at? And for 30 years, while the income per person rose, the happiness remained completely flat. Now, from that date, which was called the Easterlin paradox, till now, another 30 years, it remains completely flat. The US output per person has increased 3 times since 1960, but the happiness, no change. That's not true everywhere. Again, in my favorite countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the happiness has gone up. They've gotten richer and happier, thank you. So what's happening? Well, you find out systematically that happiness, of course, doesn't just come from income per capita. It also depends on good health, of course, but it also depends on the quality of social relations. What the sociologists, not what the economists, would want to tell us, what they call social capital. Do you trust each other? Do you have someone you can turn to for social support? Do you trust your government? Now, in the United States, the income has gone like this, and the social trust has gone like that. We've had not a collapse, but we've had sharply falling social trust as incomes have risen. People don't trust each other. Part of that is the income inequalities have widened. And we see people that make billions of dollars, and we know that they're crooks, actually. That doesn't make us happy. That tends to weaken the bonds and the trust of society. And so we identified, and I would say it's our lead analysts, Professor Richard Laird of the London School of Economics and Professor John Helliwell of the University of British Columbia, who have studied the underlying determinants of happiness. And they found income per capita to an extent, mental and physical health, yes, social trust, generosity, more generous societies, and people who give are happier, just like the ancient sages told us. They're right. Buddha was really smart, by the way. A lot of good ideas. We'd love his advice about sustainable development, too. But the point is that there are paths to happiness, and we're not necessarily on them. And I believe sustainable development can help us get on those paths, and the social inclusion pillar of sustainable development is about healthier societies, societies which are more generous, more trusting, more trustworthy, and better governed.
I have two more questions about Korea's experiences. One is that Korea was thrown into a very serious economic difficulties by the IMF crisis. What would be the lessons or implications of this experience for other developing countries, such as this question mentions Bolivia and India? And do you think that Korea may be headed toward another financial crisis like that in the years to come? And last question about Korean experiences. What are the Korea's experiences, achievements and experiences that Korea should try to share with the other developing countries?
Thank you very much. And we'll have these as the last question, yeah? Because thank you for your patience. So very, very quickly, the 1997 financial crisis was a financial crisis. That may seem like a trivial observation, but at the time, it was not the diagnosis that the IMF made, and it was not the basis of the recommendations, which were for more austerity. What we now understand, because we lived through it again in 2008, is that what Korea suffered in 1997 was a financial panic. The financial panic means that you see, perhaps you're a bank that has lent to Korean banks, and you see that other banks are starting to withdraw their loans. And you say, well, if I don't withdraw my loan, I'm not going to get repaid because the country is going to become unable to pay off everybody that's rushing for the exits. And this is what happened, of course, at the end of 1997. The way to handle a financial crisis, we know, is to lend into the financial crisis, actually, not to stop the credits. If you stop the credits, you exacerbate the panic. Whereas if there's a lender of last resort that says, don't panic, everybody gets paid. You don't have to run or stampede for the exits. People say, okay, I won't stampede today, I'll stampede next week. And everybody slows down, stops, and the panic dissipates. So the way to handle a panic is actually to create liquidity, not to stop liquidity. The IMF got it almost exactly wrong, and the US government, in its prescriptions, got it almost exactly wrong in 1997. Now, in 2008, it was very interesting. Korea was a healthy economy, and yet Lehman Brothers was allowed to fail. Disastrous mistake by the US policy authorities. And it created a panic again. And that panic became worldwide within about 3 days, in mid-September. Within a couple of weeks, Korea was facing another financial crisis, a healthy country, but all of a sudden the won was under attack and there was a ferocious exit. What happened this time is remarkable, and I don't know if there are scholars that have studied it carefully. I should know the literature better than I did, but I watched closely at the time. The Fed gave a swap line to the Bank of Korea. This time the Fed said, don't worry, we guarantee your liquidity. The panic stopped in a day. What was about to overturn the Korean economy stopped just like that because everyone said, we're backstopped by the Fed. And that was enough to stop the panic. So this is the real lesson of these financial crises. And they're different from many other kinds of crises. And I'll just end by saying that the art of good economics is what I like to call differential diagnosis, which is to know what problem you're really confronting at what historical moment. It's like being a doctor. You get lots of patients with fever, but you better identify the underlying cause of the fever, not just that the symptom is fever. And that is the real art of good economic management. In terms of the lessons that Korea offers to the world with its unique, wonderful economic experience, I think that the fundamental strategy of Korea from 1960 onward was to use brain power, know-how, science and technology to pull the economy forward. And this, I believe, is the essential core of the lesson. Korea is a country without many natural resources of any kind, without so much of the primary commodities that it transforms in its industry. And so Korea lives on its intelligence, on its education, on its science, on its technology. Korea is one of the very few countries of the world that went from poverty not only to wealth, because others did it by discovering oil under the ground, but Korea did it by becoming an innovating country. This was an incredible drive, and it really paid off, because Korea not only created a world-class education system that puts Korea at the top of all of these scores that we saw again last week, the so-called PISA comparison projects, but it puts Korea as one of the most innovating countries in the world. And at a time when science is so productive and when engineering is able to do so many miracles, this is what has created this remarkable prosperity for Korea. And you're competing not only in the top of the top leagues, but in the most competitive sectors. Samsung and Apple going head to head. That's pretty tough, but you're doing a great job. And that, I think, is really the essence of it. And I would say that all of the sustainable development challenges that I mentioned fit this mold. We need new systems, new technologies, new ways of doing things, innovations. So we're counting on you not only to create a green economy, not only to help those still stuck in poverty, but to innovate and to show the way for the world on how to do it. Thank you very much.
No one would deny that as one of the most prominent economists, you have made great contributions to making the world a better place. However, there always have been criticisms and skepticism about your work, and your famous debate with Bill Gates was a case in point. And
With who?
Bill Gates.
Oh, yeah.
And so how do you sustain your belief in what you say and stick to your path despite such criticisms?
Great. Thank you. You know, thanks for asking. I think for all of us, life is an adventure and a learning path, I have to say. And I feel blessed that basically my whole life I feel like I'm still in school, always getting an oral exam, always getting new questions, and so forth. And the truth is that I can't even imagine what I didn't know at certain times in my life. I fell in love with economics now 43 years ago. Actually, in 1972, I became spellbound with this question about why some places are rich and others are poor, why some places seem to be fair and others not fair. It's a question that never left me. And I would say that I've spent my whole life since then at the professional level trying to understand that question as best I could. I feel, I have to say, very comfortable with one thing, that I've done the best that I could at each stage. So I've always tried to apply the knowledge as accurately as possible, to study any problem as intensively as possible, and to apply a moral lens to any question, always. Because the issues we're dealing with are issues of life and death importance for people. They're not games. They're not theoretical puzzles. We're not doing pure mathematics. We're not studying nature. We're trying to find ways to help people. And that, I think, is what good economics is about. As you could hear, I've been married to a doctor for 35 wonderful years. It could have been earlier, but she wouldn't go out with me earlier than that. But I've watched my wife Sonia heal people as a pediatrician. I've watched her take a differential diagnosis. I've watched the idea that you put knowledge to work to help people. And that's what I think we ought to do. And I believe if you do the best you can, if you study very hard, because the world's really complicated. It's not simple. Every time you hear a simple thing, be skeptical. Don't be cynical. Work harder. Cynical, I believe, is immoral, by the way. Because cynical is basically saying you're ruling out solutions. And the cynics can be very clever, very snarky, but it's not the point. The point is, what shall we do to help improve things? And if you work very hard at it all the time, you study hard, you always update your knowledge, and you always act ethically, I think you can feel satisfied. And that would be my recommendation.